The hoard itself, the Galloway hoard, was buried around AD 900. It was discovered just over 10 years ago in 2014, and it contains more than 100 rare objects: silver, gold, textiles, heirlooms, and a lidded vessel with extraordinary preservation. This incredible collection was saved for the nation in 2017 after a major fundraising campaign and is now held by the National Museums in Scotland. Ongoing research is occurring through the Unwrapping the Galloway Hoard project, which continues to transform the understanding of Viking Age Scotland and its international connections. And now the person we're actually here to hear from, not me as much, is Dr. Adrian Maldonado. He is part of this Unwrapping the Galloway Hoard project, which would not be possible without a score of experts from around the world. He's also a leading expert on early medieval Scotland and the Viking Age, and his current work focuses on Viking Age silver and hoarding practices, and he continues to publish widely while also championing new ways of bringing archaeology into popular culture. We are very lucky to have an expert here with us, so please join me in welcoming Adrian. Okay, we are going to start with quite a few questions that I've been thinking, and hopefully you've all been thinking them as well. Our first one, which I should also click the button at the same time. There we go. When you first saw the hoard, what was your reaction as an archaeologist?
Well, first of all, thanks everybody for coming. It's great to see all these people here interested in something, that relates to a story of Scotland, thousands of miles away and more than 1,000 years away. It's really great to see all the interest around the world. So thanks for coming. And thanks, Erin, and everybody here at the museum. It's been so wonderful. But yeah, when I first saw the hoard, when it was very soon after it came out of the ground, when I was just a little baby boy in 2014, I was teaching archaeology at Glasgow University at that time. I'd got my PhD in 2011, so this was the early days. I was doing a lot of field work. And I wasn't yet sort of working on the Viking stuff just yet. At that point, I was studying early Christianity. What always interested me was why people changed religion more than 1,000 years ago, when they had their sort of pagan and traditional life ways for hundreds, thousands of years. Why would people change to Christianity in the sort of first millennium? And that was the kind of archaeology that I was into. So I was most interested in that cross and whether that could be, a sort of an example of a pagan Viking that had sort of, at that point, we still thought this was very much a Viking hoard. And so is that cross maybe a bit of loot, or is this from a new convert, a new believer? Now we know after conservation that this is an Anglo-Saxon cross that would have been used by someone fairly recently at the time that the hoard was buried. But at that time, I didn't really have these questions yet, and I just thought, it's just another Viking hoard, We have these in Britain and Ireland. They come out of the ground fairly frequently. And we didn't know just how special this hoard was going to be.
Thank you. So what makes the Galloway hoard so unusual?
There's so many things that make it unusual. So there's a lot of Viking Age silver arm rings, those objects that you see there with their stamped ornament. That tells you exactly where we are, when we are in time. You're in the sort of late 9th, early 10th century, the heart of the Viking Age in Britain and Ireland, when you get silver arm rings like those. But everything else that comes out after these things, everything else in the hoard actually looks less and less Viking and more sort of the 9th century, and really specific to that area in which it was found. It was found in what's now southwest Scotland. But at this time, that part of the world is Old English speaking. It's part of an Anglo-Saxon kingdom called Northumbria, which crosses the border into what's now Scotland. But at that time, Scotland, England, Ireland, these kingdoms have yet to form. And so this is a part of Scotland that actually could have gone either way. In the century before the hoard, this is an Anglo-Saxon dominated area. In the century after the hoard, it becomes a Gaelic and Norse speaking area. So this hoard captures a turning point in history. But other things really unusual about this hoard are things like textiles that are preserved. These are the soft things that really don't survive well in the ground. And this hoard has a lot of preservation of textiles. So there's linen, there's silk, and there's other objects like glass and even dirt balls, the kind of things that are never found in Viking Age hoards. And so everything about this, at every turn, it really gets more and more unusual as you go deeper and deeper into the hoard.
Thank you. Can you explain a little bit about the different layers in the hoard, particularly the decoy layer?
Yeah, that's something that's really unique to the Galloway hoard. So it was found by metal detectors, and apologies to those who have been in the pop-up talks. You've heard me say this a bunch of times, but it's such a good story anyway. It's worth going over again. It was found by metal detectorists, and these were metal detectors who had worked previously in the area. They know the good spots, so it wasn't completely by chance that they kind of knew the places where they were likely to get some kind of treasure, some kind of antiquities. And so they were metal detecting around a rural church called Balmagee. And so you expect around a medieval church, you might get some medieval finds, maybe a coin hoard, that kind of thing. And so finding some Viking silver was really sort of exciting. This is the kind of thing that metal detectorists in Scotland really hope to find, But they recognized it right away because it has these distinctive arm rings. So they knew what they were looking for. They knew that they had hit on Viking silver. And that meant it was more than 1,000 years old. So they did the right thing. They stopped digging. And that's really important. They called the authorities, and the regional archaeologists came out. And that means that the rest of the hoard could be excavated professionally and recorded, photographed, and everything inventoried. That is the kind of thing that allows us to then take everything to the lab and preserve as much of that precious organic material and a lot of that information about how these objects relate to each other. But what was really interesting was they came across this small hoard at the top that has the cross and silver bars and silver arm rings. And that would have been a find of a lifetime for anybody. So the archaeologist takes it out of the ground. Everything is well recorded. They're slapping each other on the back. Job well done. They're thrilled. And then they do the right thing. They do their due diligence. They have to make sure that they haven't missed anything. And so you get your metal detector and you do one more sweep just to make sure that there wasn't something covered by mud that you missed. And instead of getting a little beep, they get this sort of roar coming from the machine. There's a lot more still in the pit, even though they thought it was an empty sort of natural gravel hole. So they sweep away the gravel, and sure enough, all of the rest of that treasure, much larger, is down below. So we think that it's maybe a decoy layer. Before metal detecting, anybody who found that upper layer with the cross would have walked off happily with the silver treasure that they'd found, and they wouldn't think to dig any further. So we think that maybe this was intentional. And so this is one of the ways in which we think that maybe this is a hoard that was intended to be recovered, and for some reason it was never sort of retained. Nobody ever came to dig it up for 1,000 years.
I've got an excellent question from the audience, which is, has this allowed more excavations around the church? And do you think there might be any more hoards around there?
Okay, that's a great question. Yeah, so have there been more investigations of that church? And the answer is no, actually. So when something like this comes out of the ground, what you do is you do an excavation, professional excavation, hopefully, and make sure that the treasure itself is recorded. And then in this case, because it was such an important find, there was a commercial archaeology unit that goes and investigates a wider area outside to sort of see if it's in some kind of context, like a settlement or a church or something. And so they excavated a wider area around the pit. And at the entrance of the exhibition, one of the first labels has the plan that shows the result of that excavation. It looks like the hoard was buried in a timber building. It looks like a timber hall. And the museum display here has this lovely sort of wooden gable that's in the shape of a timber hall. And I think that's really appropriate because that's where the hoard was found. It was in a building like this. But the other thing that happens when you find something really important like this, that legal protections then immediately come in. What you don't want is more metal detecting coming around and sort of snooping around unsupervised. At this point, we know that there's something really significant in that field, and so legal protections come in. So that area is now scheduled under Scottish law. That means that it stops people from metal detecting, and it stops people from building a house over it, let's say. But there is still potential for more work to happen there. But it has to come from that local community. It has to be something that is really beneficial to sort of health and well-being, and something that's going to bring sort of more resources into that community. That's the kind of reason that more work would happen. It hasn't happened yet, but I think it does need a lot more work.
Excellent, thank you. So the cross, one of the most incredible objects in the Hoard. So you were saying before that it could have been recently worn. It's decorated in Anglo-Saxon style. So what do you think about, is it plunder or is it suggest a more complex story?
So this is one of these sort of iconic objects now from this hoard. This is a silver cross, and it's a lot of silver. So there are these silver ingots, these silver bars in the exhibition, in that top layer where this was found. And it would take 3 of those silver bars to make something like this. It's a heavy cross, it's big. And it's one of only 2 which survive. Now, we assume that somebody wearing a cross made out of silver, decorated in gold like this, would have been a high-ranking person, like a bishop, an abbot, or an abbess, the leader of a religious house. Somebody in the sort of elite stratum of the church, okay? High-ranking clergy would have worn something like this. And there's only 2 silver crosses like this that are known from Britain. The other one's from another Viking hoard found in London. So we know that there was more of these. These are just the only 2 that have survived. This one is way more elaborate and bigger and heavier than the other one that we know about. This one has the symbols of the 4 evangelists. These are the authors of the first 4 gospel books, which become the New Testament of the Bible. And so these are symbols, they're icons of the Christian religion. And to know what they mean, you have to be born and raised and literate in that tradition. So these are symbols. So the arm on the left side of the screen, that's the ox of St. Luke. And the one on the far right, that's the winged lion of St. Mark. The angel of St. Matthew below, and just off the screen is the eagle of St. John. These are symbols that would have been known to other Christians. And so again, you're talking about something that is worn for a Christian audience. But it's not pristine. It's still got its silver wire wrapped around it. It's the only cross of its kind that still has its sort of silver wire, as if it was taken off of someone's neck that morning. But it's not complete. It's missing the central element. You see that empty circle in the middle? That would have had a gemstone, a bead, a glass jewel, maybe a bit of amber or rock crystal, something clear. And that would have represented Christ at the center of the cross. So that's been removed carefully. And so the question is, was it removed and the rest of the cross just reduced to a bit of silver, packed with its silver arm rings and its silver bars? Is it just there for its value in silver? Or has someone taken that as a relic, as a token, as the sacred part of this cross? And so depending on what you think, kind of changes the interpretation of this. But personally, I like that the cross is put at the very top of the hoard. It's found in that decoy layer, maybe offering a bit of protection to everything below.
Excellent. Speaking about arm rings, which forms a large part of this collection, we've noticed that some of them are inscribed with Anglo-Saxon runes. What does this tell us about the hoard's ownership and connections?
Yeah, the runic inscriptions are one of the most amazing, the luckiest kind of survivals. So, like I said, we actually have quite a few Viking Age hoards of silver arm rings and silver ingots. That's why we know so much about this kind of object. We know that in the time of Viking raids, there's a lot of this silver flowing through Britain and Ireland, okay? And this is what the Vikings are after. There's so much silver, in fact, that a lot of it is ending up in the ground. People bury it for safety, I guess, or maybe as offerings, And so we have lots of examples of silver arm rings that are buried and that are found by metal detecting and other activity later. But you almost almost never do they have anything written on them. You never get a letter saying this belongs to John or Olaf or whatever the case may be. Sometimes you have runes on silver objects, but they're generally speaking Viking runes, the kind of runes that is an alphabet used in Scandinavia. And some arm rings and some brooches in other hoards do have things like the first 6 letters of the alphabet, or one runic letter repeated 3 times. These are kind of magical formula. It's just sort of letters used as kind of magical protection. So writing was seen as something that could maybe protect the hoard from demons or from other people finding it. In this case, though, those runes on these arm rings, which are very rare, turned out not to be Viking runes, but this is actually the runic alphabet used in Anglo-Saxon England. And again, this is a part of Scotland that at that time was an Old English-speaking area. So this is the local alphabet, if you like. And 3 of those are very short inscriptions: Ed, Till, and Bear. Those are Old English words, but they're also the first syllable of Old English names, like Tilred, Beowulf, and Edward. So we think those are abbreviated personal names. That arm ring that you see all the way on the right is one of the finds that was only found after the hoard was discovered. When the archaeologists came back and dug the rest of the site, there were bits of silver scattered into the plow soil, which tells us that this is a site where they're actually taking in silver, they're melting it down into these bars, and they're redistributing it. So this is one of the finds that relates to that timber hall. We think this is what's going on this site. And that one also has a runic inscription. And that one is a complete name. It's Egbrecht, which is just the name Egbert. It's a personal male name. All of these are Old English. But that runic inscription on the top of the ring, the largest of the rings, has the longest runic inscription. This one was also in Old English runes, in the same alphabet as the rest of them, but was undeciphered for years. Our runologists couldn't make heads or tails of it. It was when I was looking down the microscope that the last of the letters I noticed was actually not on its own. It was marked out with a dot on either side. It's an F rune, and it's marked off with a dot on either side, which means it's an abbreviation. F stands for something. And that helped unlock the rest of the mysterious runic inscription. Now our current reading of it is, this is the community's wealth. So we have 3 personal names, Egbert over there, and then an inscription that says, this treasure belongs to a community of people. And what that community is, who they were, it remains mysterious. But it's one of these things that it's a real rare and precious clue as to who buried this hoard and why.
So interesting. It's a random question, but is Norse and Anglo-Saxon like an interchangeable language, or would they be quite different for someone reading it of that period?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. So Norse, the Old Norse language and the Old English language are both related. They're both part of the Germanic language group. And that means that they do have some similarity. And there are arguments as to whether people speaking Old Norse could communicate pretty easily with people speaking Old English. But it would be the same as a Spanish speaker communicating with an Italian speaker. They are different languages, but there's enough in common with the grammar and enough shared words that you could maybe thrash it out. So I'm a Spanish speaker, native Spanish speaker. I was born in Puerto Rico. And whenever I go to Italy or France, I can kind of fake my way through for a while and then sort of try and order something or read the menu. But then, I can't really take the conversation much further after that. But there are these sort of common touch points that I can kind of fake my way through by knowing Spanish, other sort of Romance languages. And maybe it's something like that for between Old Norse and Old English speakers.
In regards to the armbands, we know some of them in our hoard, or most of them I should say, are flat and they weren't ever designed to be worn. But how would they have been worn by people of that period?
Yeah, this is one of the interesting things about these arm rings. I keep calling them arm rings, even though none of them are kind of ring-shaped. The ones that you see on display in the upper and the lower hoard, most of them are laid out flat. Sometimes they're folded in half or they're pinched in at the ends, but they're flat rather than sort of meant to be worn around the wrist. The arm rings are developed and used for a short span of time, only about 50 years. When the Vikings come from Scandinavia, in Scandinavia what they do with their silver is they show it off. They wear it around their neck in elaborate sort of braided and plaited neck rings, which are really beautiful, and they wear them around their wrist. And this is for men and women. So anybody with access to gold and silver would show it off in their jewelry. And in a pre-banking, pre-monetary society, that's how you show that you're a member of the elite. And no one's going to steal it from you because they also have weapons that they wear. And so that's how you sort of show off your wealth in Scandinavia. It's not something that they're doing in Britain or Ireland until the Vikings arrive. When the Vikings arrive, they start setting up trade towns. So the capital of Ireland is Dublin, and Dublin was founded by the Vikings. When they come to Ireland, first they're raiders, and then they begin to settle, and they start forming harbor towns. And those are the first towns in Irish history. And they're doing very similar things in England. So York in northern England becomes very much a Viking-dominated town around the time of this Hoard. England and Carolingian France and Germany, these are coin-using economies by that time. But Scotland and Ireland are not. And so when the Vikings are going in between places, they're going from coin-using places to non-coin-using places, the easiest thing to do is to melt down all of their silver and carry it around in bars. But then they also bring in this idea, this Scandinavian idea of wearing your wealth. And these arm rings, with their distinctive stamped decoration, they're a Scandinavian idea, but they're being made in Ireland as far as we can tell. And they're being made specifically for trade between England, Ireland, and Scotland in this area of the Irish Sea. And this is exactly where the Galloway hoard is. And so these are a form of currency. By this time, these arm rings are being decorated and they're being used as money. So they didn't even bother finishing them. They stamped them to look like these arm rings, but they didn't then bend them around their wrists. They are actively being used as a kind of currency. So these are money.
Excellent, thank you. So the hoard also contains silks, heirlooms, and, strangely, dirt balls. What do these unexpected materials reveal about the international networks and belief systems of the people in this area?
Yeah, so one of the amazing things, so that's the lid of that lidded vessel. This is the very heart of the hoard. Down in the lowest layer of the hoard, you have a lidded vessel, which is really strange and quite unique on its own. We know now that it's an ancient Sasanian vessel that comes from all the way in Central Asia. So it's already an antique, a really precious heirloom by the time it's used to stash a bunch of treasure in Scotland in the year 900. So the vessel itself is really significant. But what was buried within that vessel, what they took real care to stash in that bowl, and that's the first thing that goes into the ground, was actually really rare and unusual. There's some gold and some silver, but there's a lot of other things that don't have that monetary value in this vessel. There are glass beads, there's a ball of rock crystal, and there's 2 dirt balls. And these things are really rare. You never find these in Viking Age hoards, which are usually just gold and silver. Somebody took the time to prepare these things, and the more we looked at those beads, the more we realized that some of them are actually very old. Some of them are sort of contemporary with the hoard, but some of them are 200, 300 years old. There's heirlooms in here, there's antiques, and there's one thing which is an amulet. It looks like a bead and it's bundled in with the beads, but it is a sort of sphere of rock. It's a naturally occurring mineral that's hollow on the inside, but it has like a little bit of flint or something else rattling around in it, so that when you lift it up and shake it, it rattles. We know that amulets like these were associated in previous times, according to folklore. They're associated with childbirth and pregnancy. And all of those beads are also female gendered items. What we know about those beads is that they're found in women's burials.
So a lot of the stuff in that lidded vessel actually belongs to women and families that have passed down these beads over multiple generations. So something really rare and unusual in those treasures, those glass beads and things, would have been absolutely priceless to that family that kept them over many years. So to them, even though they're made out of glass and dirt and other things, those would have been absolutely as valuable or more valuable than all the other gold and silver in the hoard.
I've got a very difficult question for you now.
Okay.
Why do you think the hoard was buried?
Okay. Why do you think it was buried? Why do you think the hoard was buried? So that is, for all of the science that we've done on this hoard, we've thrown every technique in the book at it. And we've even developed some new techniques. We've partnered with the University of Oxford, the British Museum, University of Glasgow. And together, they've actually developed new techniques to kind of tell us where the silver is coming from, where the textiles were made, and all sorts of other questions that we never knew how to answer before. This material has allowed us to investigate. But the question of motivation is something that is sort of in the mind. It's subjective, and it's something that actually we can only make educated guesses at. But the Galloway hoard, more than usual, gives us more clues as to the people behind it than any other hoard. It has personal names. It even has a message saying this is the community's wealth. But why did that community then bury that wealth? And then also, why didn't they come back? So the clues that we have are personal names. They're Viking objects on the outside of that hoard, but there's also Anglo-Saxon material and even older material. So this community is diverse. It probably includes local Anglo-Saxons who are writing their names on these things, but it might include some Norse speakers as well. There's probably Irish people. One of the beads in that vessel is definitely made in Ireland, and there is one Scandinavian arm ring amongst all of the others. So this is probably a diverse group of people. Even though this is an Old English speaking, an Anglo-Saxon part of the world, I think there's more than that going on, and I think they're represented in this hoard. There's also not just warlords and kings and queens. There's members of the clergy. There are Christian objects like that cross and the rock crystal jar that you can see in the exhibition. These things look like Christian relics. And so there's members of the clergy here as well. This community is really diverse. My gut feeling is that this is the greatest treasures, the valuables of a group of people coming together for some kind of negotiation, whether it's a contract or an oath or a sale of land or a changing of a regime. Maybe this is a sort of handover of some of the greatest treasures from a dynasty that is being replaced by a new Viking dynasty. That's also possible as well. And that would maybe include why there's both Viking and local Anglo-Saxon treasures here. Another possibility is that, this is a contract or an oath. Maybe it's a peacekeeping ceremony, and it has everybody's treasures from both sides. It's a possibility. What I really like about the hoard is that there's this arm ring cluster down below. It's these arm rings that are clasped together. There's 4 arm rings clasped together in a bundle. And those are very sort of strongly Viking objects. One of the rings has animal heads, like these pagan sort of creatures. But tucked within that arm ring, this cluster of arm rings, there's that beautiful gold bird-shaped pin that is so iconic. It's in the sort of entrance graphic of the exhibition itself. And that is a Christian Anglo-Saxon object. So you have pagan and Christian bundled together. And that really looks to me like a group of different people coming together, maybe to swear an oath to one another, or sort of hopefully to keep the peace, or something like this. So that's my gut feeling. But whatever happened, this treasure was buried underground, and I think it was intended to be recovered, but it never was. And so whatever happened, whatever people were in charge of putting this together, they never came back for it. And that has to color our interpretation of what happens. So we can make an educated guess, but it'd be interesting to see what you think is most likely as well.
We'll give you a slightly easier question now. So the hoard was valued at £1.98 million. when it was allocated to National Museum Scotland. So what has been the benefit of having it in the National Collection?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. So there's a sort of really there's a long and kind of tangled legal process that treasure like this has to go through. But this was all done by the book. So the archaeologists came out and excavated it. And so we could be sure that it was complete and there wasn't other stuff that they metal detected from another site added in, and the kinds of monkey business that could sometimes happen to inflate the price of a find like this. We know that that's not the case here. This was excavated and recorded, and we are sure that this came out of the ground where where it's supposed to be from. That inflates, that sort of affects the price. And this is all determined by a committee of experts who value it based on what's in it, the market value of silver and gold, but also the sort of intangible cultural value of how important the things are. And things like textiles and inscriptions all make this a lot more important than your ordinary Viking treasure. So the ultimate valuation was 1.97 million pounds, and that is something that any museum would have a hard time finding. It's not the kind of money that any museum has anymore, you know? And so it was allocated to the National Museum because we have a lot of resources. We have labs and the conservation specialists to take on a project like this. But we also have the machinery and the infrastructure to do a great fundraising bid. And so the National Museum was able to display some of the more stable objects of gold and silver that don't they don't corrode, and so those were able to be cleaned off and displayed temporarily, and that allowed the fundraising appeal to be backed by things that people could actually see. And in the end, we had a lot of big funders like the Art Fund, these great big charitable organizations that helped make up that money. But in addition to that, we had 1,600 individual private donations at the site of the museum or through the web. And it's because of all those individuals who donated that actually the money was raised, and it was enough to secure it for the nation. So having it come to NMS means the resources and the capability to study and do all the great work that we've done. But at the end of this tour, once it's displayed, it's already toured around Scotland, and now it's doing a world tour. At the end of this, we've actually come to an agreement with the local council where the hoard was found. So Edinburgh is Scotland's capital, and that's where most of the tourism comes. We get 2 million visitors to the museum every year. So that's where most people can see that hoard. But it's also important that that local community where the hoard was found gets some benefit from this as well. And so we've come to an agreement that when the hoard returns to Scotland, part of it will be displayed in Edinburgh and part of it will be displayed in Kirkcudbright, which is the local museum closest to where the hoard was actually found. And that way, both the local community and the nation get the sort of, get as many eyes on it as possible, and it benefits the people from where it was found as well.
Excellent, thank you. Talking about conservation and the ability that NMS has to perform that work, what challenges did the conservators, including Mary, face when working with this collection?
Yeah, this hoard had so many different materials behind it that it really needed a team of people. The conservation team behind this hoard were led by Mary Davis. So Mary Davis is one of the people I'm really lucky to be friends with now. When I joined the project, I knew her as a kind of conservator who had done a lot of work on really famous sort of treasures in various museums around the nation, including in the National Museum of Scotland. She had worked on Viking collections already way back in the 90s when the museum reopened. And so Mary Davis is one of these people who specializes in glass and prehistory, but knows every material inside and out from years of experience. We were really lucky to get somebody as experienced as she was. So she tackled things like gold and silver, but also silk and linen. She knew exactly the best tools to clean these objects off without damaging them. And where they had textile preserved, to make sure that we capture as much of that without losing it. The stuff is really fragile. But you can also see her handiwork in the exhibition. There's a time-lapse video of her cleaning off that cross, and you can see the tools that she uses, which are really unusual. There's things like porcupine quills, which are just stiff enough that can actually take some of the corrosion off without scratching or damaging the silver underneath. And she's the kind of person that knows exactly what kind of tools to use for that. But she also made decisions about how this was to be displayed. The silver can be shined up. The gold can be cleaned off and sort of gleams in that way. But she also made decisions to leave some of the green corrosion from these objects on them visible. So you can see at the very center, there's a silver brooch. It's a sort of circular shaped object that is silver in its terminals, but you can see the green corrosion still retained on that silver hoop. Those green bits of corrosion are where textile has come into contact with the metal. And she says she believes that that is really informative of how the hoard was buried and how it was found. So she chose to leave that on as a demonstration of the scientific process of how this sort of textile survived. And that lidded vessel was wrapped in 3 layers. It was first wrapped in white linen, and then it was tied off with silk cords, and then the whole thing was captured and bundled up in a wool fabric. And so it has these 3 layers of textile still adhering to it on its surface. And she made the decision, instead of sort of peeling all that off, we can actually get through that with CT scans and with x-rays, so we know the ornament underneath those textiles. She chose to leave some of the textile still adhering to that surface so that people can see exactly how it was prepared and how it survived for those 1,000 years. And it's a form of sort of educating people about the sort of process of archaeology and the process of conservation while showing them a beautiful object. So there's a balance in between sort of preserving as is and sort of shining things up for the public display. And Mary and the NMS conservation team are absolute experts at this.
And how long did the cleaning and restoration take?
Absolute years. And so the gold and silver were displayed right away in 2017. Most of it was available for display right away as soon as it was kind of conserved and stabilized. But the materials inside the lidded vessel that were wrapped in textile, that were really fragile and had a lot of organic material, we didn't even start to work on those objects until 2021. And that was when I joined the project as part of a new phase of work called Unwrapping the Galloway Hoard. And that was when we joined forces with Oxford and the British Museum to make sure that we did this carefully. And that project started in 2021. Some of the objects weren't fully unwrapped and revealed until 2023 or 2024. So there's the 3 animal-headed gold mounts that you can see near the center of the photograph there. Those were, they have never been displayed in the UK because they were still in the laboratory, still being conserved as late as 2023. So they've never been displayed in the UK. They're actually being displayed in Australia for the first time ever.
What did the objects tell us about Galloway's links to the wider Viking world, island, and beyond to the Silk Road?
Yeah, there's so much in here that really relates to the world well outside of Scotland. So that lidded vessel itself, where these treasures, you're looking down the lidded vessel here as it was in the laboratory when they had taken most of the objects out. What you're looking at there is what's settled down and trickled down to the very bottom of the vessel. Those metal objects are the things that were placed into the vessel first. If they're at the bottom of the vessel, that's the first things that go in. And so those are some of the most precious treasures in here. But in amongst all that, you can see all the scraps of broken and sort of fragmented bits of textile. It's not mud, that's not dirt. That's actually decayed linen, silk, and wool, the kind of stuff that was wrapping these objects and has kind of flaked off and crumbled away and settled at the bottom of the vessel. What you can see there on the right, though, is one of those 2 dirt balls. Now, these are really rare objects. There's nothing like this that has been found in an archaeological context, because if you're digging in the ground, It would just look like dirt. But when it was sort of presented in this vessel that had been sealed, you know that it was deliberate. And they were deliberately included for some reason. Now, what's interesting about those dirt balls is that we had them CT scanned and X-rayed with our partners at the British Museum. And they have microscopic traces of gold and bone all the way through. So that is really unusual. Gold, you could say, has flaked off from the objects nearby. It's touching all these gold objects, but it's all the way through this. And the bone, there is no sort of bone object in this. There's no burial that this could have come from. So what we think these are the kind of relics that early medieval pilgrims would take back with them when they went to Rome and the Holy Land. We have records of people, pilgrims, going to these holy sites, these biblical sites, and what they would do is they would get a bit of clay or a bit of mud and roll it in the earth of that grave or of that shrine and take some of that back with them to their church, put that in the altar or carry it with them as a form of protection. And we think that that's what these two are. These are incredibly rare, and they just really shouldn't survive. But because of the conditions of that find and the preservation that it was allowed by excavating this in a laboratory setting, it means that we have this incredible material that just doesn't survive anywhere else.
How does this hoard challenge the stereotypical view of the Vikings?
Yeah, I mean, when the hoard came out of the ground, again, it's a Viking hoard. That's all the headlines. That's all that we called it. But the more we got into it, the less and less Viking it looks, and the more and more of that time it seems to capture. It's a window into the Viking age as much as to the Vikings. So the Vikings are present. Their arm rings, their ingots, their money is all outside the vessel. That cluster of arm rings, that's coming from the Viking world. So they're here. But the real treasures to the people who buried this seem to be those really carefully bundled and wrapped objects that are in that lidded vessel. So at this point, we are talking about, again, members of the church, women, family members who have passed down heirlooms of their family for generations at a time. I think this is a glimpse of the Viking Age that is a world away from sort of long ships and axes and death and destruction. This kind of gives us a glimpse of what people thought was important and the wealth and value that these families still had, even 100 years into the first raids of the Vikings, even though everything is changing and changing quickly. I think there's still this sort of local culture that people are trying very hard to preserve. And this gives us a glimpse into the other side of the equation. What did it feel like to be under the sort of under these changes, these rapid changes going on in the Viking Age?
I feel like I've made you talk a lot in case you need a sip of water. The next question that I'm really interested in is what stories that the heirlooms and the reused objects tell about memory and family in these communities.
Yeah, I think there's a slide that shows the sort of beads and the amulets somewhere there. There it is. So this is a group of objects at the very top of the lidded vessel. And Mary Davis, our conservator, has looked back at the photographs of the day that it was first opened, and you can tell that these objects were actually wrapped together in a single bundle. There's only one scrap of textile remaining, and it's on the object in the sort of top left there. It's a bead pendant, which has a little scrap of textile that you can still see in the exhibition. And so that bundle of textile would have been wrapped around this object. So this is a coherent group that was bundled together. Now, what's interesting about those is that they're glass beads and one rock crystal ball and that rattling stone. That's that brown sphere on the bottom right there. It's a mix of different things and a mix of different materials, but it's also a mix of different ages. So those glass beads are actually from different time periods themselves. The two large, chunky, brownish, yellowy ones, those are actually about 300 years old. The parallels we have for those are from Merovingian France, which is, again, 300 years or so before this hoard was buried in the 6th century. The sort of wavy yellow and green beads that you see there in the center, those are a little bit younger. They're about 200 years old. by the time this is buried. And that blue and stripy one is an Irish bead that is bang up to date. That one's of the 9th century. And so you have multiple generations. It's like a collection of beads over time that were carefully selected to represent something about that family. But there's certainly a family contingent here. There's a family component to that. And what I find really interesting is that bead pendant there with its little coin in there. That coin is of a Mercian king, an Anglo-Saxon king, who died in 820. So this coin is at least 80 years old. And that pendant that the coin is sort of glued into is really significant. It's silvery looking now, but it's actually another glass bead. This is another one of these heirloom beads that is actually cracked, and you can see the crack in it. And so instead of throwing that bead away, this was an ancient bead by this time. It's an heirloom itself. Instead of throwing that bead away, what they've done is they've enclosed it in a silver case. And that silver case is really special because it has sort of windows at the top and at the bottom, so you can see the glass bead within. And so you're kind of preserving that glass bead, but you're also honoring it almost like a relic, you know, something that was really special. And they've made it into this unique object, and they've kind of date stamped it with a coin, which tells us it was made early in the 9th century. So this is already its own heirloom by the time it was made, and it's an heirloom by the time it was buried. But that tells you that these things are really valued and cared for over multiple generations. These are curated objects.
Excellent, thank you. So a big question now is, what unanswered questions do you still have about the Hoard?
Yeah, what you're looking at there, you're looking at the dirt balls again. There's a lot of unanswered questions about, you know, the motivation behind this. Why did they bury it? Why didn't they come back for it? But there's also material questions that we can investigate as sort of techniques get better, scientific techniques improve. I think we'll be able to find more things out. We have really small and fragile pieces of textile still left, and we've radiocarbon dated what we can, and we've sent samples for dye analysis where it's available. But all of these processes do nibble away at this precious resource, and you want kind of technology to move a little bit further so the techniques are less destructive and help you kind of preserve what's there. One thing that we haven't done anymore is work on those two little dirt balls. And they look huge on your screen there, but they are tiny. They're tiny little things. What you're looking at there is slices of the CT scan that was done by the British Museum. Okay, so that helps us see all the way through them, and we can confirm that there's bone and gold all the way through these objects. But we haven't dated that, and we don't know if that bone is animal or human. So we don't know that these are necessarily relics of the saints. We're just sort of guessing at that. But they're so small and so fragile that we don't want to nibble away at these. We don't want to destroy them yet. But they're techniques that can get DNA out of almost anything these days. And I think techniques are improving more and more, that one day I think we'll be able to kind of sample some of that bone without actually destroying it. And I think at that point we'll be able to say more about whether these are indeed relics or something else. That's just one of the examples of things that I think we can do as the sort of technology sort of progresses. That's why it's important to keep these things preserved. And those dirt balls haven't traveled with the exhibition. They're in sort of cold storage to kind of keep them preserved, keep them intact. But one day, again, when technology improves and we know more about them, it would be great to actually see these on display.
What would you like to keep working on? What are you most excited for coming up?
There's so many different ways I want to keep working on this material. So I joined the National Museum in Edinburgh in 2018. I've been at the museum for 7 years, and it's been the most fun I've had in my sort of professional career. And every day you're learning more and more from colleagues like my conservator, who's a scientist, and my other colleagues who are historians. And so, you know, there's all these different ways into the Viking Age. And what I found really interesting is why people bury stuff in the ground to begin with. You know, it's something that is very characteristic of the Viking Age. And we assume it's because it's a violent time. And that's why, you know, people are scared and they're putting things under the ground and then they're not coming back for them because they got killed. and they never came back for their treasures. But I think there's a lot more different ways in which we can interpret treasures like this. This hoard, for instance, was buried very close to a church. It's a timber hall, and we don't know who occupied that hall, but it could have been the hall, let's say, the residence of a bishop as much as a king or a lord. I'd like to actually find out more about that site, and it's under legal protection now, but I think there is still other ways, non-destructive ways, that we can actually work with the community and investigate this more, maybe reopen some of these trenches and find out who's living there, and then kind of find out more about the community itself and dig around the site. And that's the kind of thing that you want to reach out to people who live in that area, who know these landscapes. Ask them what they know about these landscapes and ask them what questions they still have about their own heritage, and work together that way. I think finding out more about the place where this was buried, I think, is really going to help sort of help answer some of these questions that I still have about this hoard.
Thank you very much. I think it's time for some questions from the audience. I'll get Maya to walk around with the microphone, so if you've got a question, just pop your hand up. And in the meantime, while we find one, I will ask you one of our questions from Slido, which is, what scientific methods do you use to trace the origins of the silver? I believe it mentions upstairs that one of the items was from Iran.
Oh yeah. So one of the really exciting things that we developed a new technique for this with our partners in the University of Oxford. This is led by Dr. Jane Kershaw, and she's in the video, two of the video displays in the exhibition, so you can hear it from her. But she and her team developed a new way of testing the alloy of silver. So silver, even though this is pure silver, it's like 95, 96, 97% pure silver that we're dealing with in this hoard. But that other 3% is metal that has kind of been added to the pot to either strengthen it or stretch it out a bit, or naturally occurring. So when silver is mined out of the ground, it comes with a lot of traces of lead and other trace minerals like zinc and bismuth. And these little trace elements are the clues that you can actually use to track down the sources of silver. So the percentage of bismuth or zinc is higher in some sources, and different kinds of lead are available in different kinds of silver mines. So the ore is very significant here. And they've found that if they sample ores from across Europe and Asia, they can then match, almost like fingerprinting the silver, to one of those sources. And what they found was that most of the silver of the arm rings and the ingots is coming from melted down Anglo-Saxon silver. The silver brooches that are in this hoard are a very similar silver to the arm rings and the ingots. That means that's the source of the silver. They're melting down objects like those into these arm rings. And so this is Anglo-Saxon loot in that area that's being taken back to Ireland and remade into this money. But the most spectacular find was the silver-lidded vessel that has this strange iconography, this strange imagery that looked like a sort of Zoroastrian religion. It looks like the religious symbolism of the ancient Persian Empire, which at this point was already in the past. This was already sort of an area that had been taken over by the Islamic caliphates in Central Asia. We were able to sniff out the silver in that lidded vessel, and that pointed to a Central Asian origin as well. And with further work, they've tested the inlays, they've tested the decoration, and with all of that put together, they are now confident that that vessel, that lidded vessel, was indeed made in a single area of Iran. So it's definitely come from thousands of miles away to be in this hoard, and it was probably itself 100 or 200 years old by the time it was buried here. So this hoard contains connections to the Silk Roads and the four corners of the known world by the year 900.
The hoard was buried between the two lines of posts. That, to me, is, as a building designer, is suggesting it was buried within the wall, probably as they built it, or possibly just randomly it landed there after the wall was gone. Do you have dating to place it sort of within the time frame of the building?
What a great question. Absolutely. Yeah. So when that building was excavated, you really want the edge of the pit that took the hoard to interact with one of the post holes, but it's directly in between the post holes, so we don't know which one comes first. So the only thing they were able to do was get organic material from the wood that was in those post holes, and there was only a few of those bits surviving. We did get those radiocarbon dated, and they fall within the time range of the hoard. So all the radiocarbon dates came back 8th to 9th century. But not 10th century. So we're confident that that building was probably in place by the time the hoard was buried. But it could also be that the building was already built and abandoned by the time the hoard was buried in the walls. So is this a ruined building? It hasn't burned down, but it could be already abandoned by the time it was buried. What we know is that the settlement doesn't then go on to be used. That timber hall doesn't seem to have any 10th or 11th century occupation. That means that it was buried, that the hoard was buried in a building. But whether that building was still in use or whether it had just recently been abandoned is still kind of up for grabs. That's why I think there's still more work that needs to be done to kind of understand the occupation of that building, get into the floor layers of that building if they're possible, and date those, and then you can get a really good chronology, and then we can sort of begin to answer these questions. Yeah, it does need a lot more work, but that's a great question. Thank you.
Hi there. If the structure that the hoard was found just inside is a hall or a longhouse, was it on an end wall or a side wall?
It is buried in one of the side walls, but towards what would have been the east end of this building. So towards the east end of the building, but not quite there. It is in one of the side walls. And that building does face northeast, as far as we can tell. We don't have the other end of it. That was outside of the trench that was excavated. We have one end, and so we know it is at least 8 meters long. So it is what you might call a longhouse. But it is there's not enough left to say whether this was a sort of Anglo-Saxon style or a Norse style longhouse. I think a Norse style longhouse would have curving bowed walls, so I don't think it's that. And the radiocarbon dates of the 8th and 9th century lead me to believe that I think it's a sort of local, like an Anglo-Saxon style hall, but it could go either way. It could technically be a timber church as well, although the church as it stands now is at the top of the hill overlooking this site. And I think that's probably, in Scotland, churches tend to kind of stay put and settlements move around the church. And so I think it's likely that if there was a church, it's probably underneath where the church is now. So I think it's unlikely to be a church, but technically, we can't rule it out.
I'm on my way.
Thanks for the talk. When you were telling us about the longer runic inscription, referring to the community's wealth, I heard an implication that you think that that was an inscription done just before the depositing of the hoard. Do you have evidence to suggest that it was contemporaneous with the depositing, or could it have been written generations earlier?
Oh, what a great question. Yeah. So, everything that we have from radiocarbon dates and the date of the objects tells us that this was buried around the year 900. Those styles of arm rings are dated by other hoards that have coins in them that allow us to narrow down the dates. And where that work has been done, they date to a really narrow window of time. Those Hiberno-Norse broadband arm rings is the technical name for them, but they are dated from a window beginning in 880 to 930. It's a 50-year window, and that seems to be when they were being used. After that point, the Vikings already begin to mint their own coins, and they don't need these arm rings anymore. So they kind of localize, and they start minting coins just like everybody else. So it's a 50-year window of time. And so this hoard could have been buried anytime within that window, but because of the kinds of objects, the majority of the other datable objects are 9th century objects. The beads, the bracelets, the brooches, they're all kind of Anglo-Saxon objects in that art style that really doesn't go past the 10th century. So in combination with that, we think it's buried around 900, but it could be as early as 880 technically speaking. So you're absolutely right. It doesn't need to have been done for the burial of this hoard. That could have been something that was done whenever that arm ring was made and those messages carried on there. But we think it was buried around 900, which means it could have been 10, maybe 20 years before. But you're absolutely right. It doesn't have to have been inscribed on it just for the burial. That's an interesting point, and I wonder what the implications of that would be. That's great. Something to think about.
We've got one last question. Lucky last.
Oh, come on.
Fine. Okay, we can do 2 last
There we go.
questions.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Hi, Adrian. I've got 2 questions, if I may. First is
Right, okay, we'll do one after this as well.
a quick question. First is, why do you think the cross is Anglo-Saxon? And the second question is about the church. How far back can we trace the church? Because, you know, a lot of dedications in Scotland go back to the dawn of time. So can we actually trace the church back at all?
Yeah, 2 good questions. Okay, the art style is what kind of puts it in that Anglo-Saxon world. So the brooches in the lidded vessel, the bird pin, and the cross are all kind of decorated in the same art style using niello. This is black silver sulfide. It's kind of a waste product from working silver. It turns black the way that silver does when it sort of is exposed to air. But what's great about niello is that it's this rich, dark black color, and you can inlay it onto the clean white silver or the bright yellow gold, and it creates this lovely contrast. That's a decorative technique that they're using in 9th century England in what they call Trewhiddle art style. And those figures are in that classic sort of Trewhiddle art style. The bird pin, the brooches, and the cross are all decorated in that same style. So we're pretty confident that this is a sort of 9th century artwork from Northumbria or from somewhere else, but within England. About that church, the earliest record of a church at Balmagee is in the 12th century. And at that point, it was called Kirk Anders, which is the local pronunciation of the Church of St. Andrew. And that's a dedication that could take us back to the 8th or 9th century. That's when we get the first church is dedicated to St. Andrew, who becomes then the national saint. If you've ever seen the Scottish flag, it's the cross of St. Andrew. So that becomes the national saint. But the earliest dedications are in the 8th and 9th century. It could go back that far. But so far, we only have that place name first recorded in the 12th century. I think it's very likely that medieval churches in this area go back all the way at least as far as the 8th or 9th century. But in some cases, like at Whithorn, which is also in Galloway, Whithorn goes back to the 6th century. So there have been churches for a long time. I'm pretty confident that there has been a church there. It's got an early kind of place name. It's in a really prominent location. But so far, there's no archaeological evidence. We haven't actually been able to dig inside the church. The church is still in use for Sunday service, and people are still being buried in that churchyard. It's still in active use, and so you can't really get away with doing excavations there. So far, there's no physical evidence for how old that church is, but we know that it goes back at least to the 12th century, if not further.
Go ahead.
Hi, Adrian. Hi, Erin. This is regarding the motivations of the community to place, or whoever it was, to place these items in what looks to be the walls of a building. Has anyone in the research community, historians or otherwise, cross-referenced with the sagas or the land ownership to see what was going on politically at that time that might have caused a group of culturally diverse people to very suddenly potentially put things in a safe place?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah, so there's a really interesting moment in time here. This is before Scotland, England, and Ireland. What you have at this point in history are these regional kingdoms. It's people who speak the same language and follow the same law. That's what kingdoms are. Instead of lines on a map, It's people that define a kingdom. Wherever they are, that's where the kingdom is. And so you have the Pictish kingdom further north. You have the British kingdom of Strathclyde to the west. You have Irish kingdoms, several different Irish kingdoms at this point, and several Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. But at this point, England is now, it's now joined into two big kingdoms. There's a kingdom of England is forming, still called the Kingdom of Wessex, led by King Alfred the Great. You know, in the 880s, he's fighting these great battles with the Vikings. And they come to an agreement, they come to a truce, that the sort of incoming Danish warriors get like half of England, and that's called the Danelaw. They are now controlled, and they follow a sort of Scandinavian law, and they speak a Scandinavian and an English language together. So England, as it is now, is actually split into these two communities, and a sort of an Anglo-Saxon one and a Danish one. And Scotland is also divided. What happens in Galloway is kind of a mystery. So we have bishops in a place called Whithorn, which is not terribly far. That's the local where a Bishop Higwald would be based. The nearest bishop and the nearest cathedral church would have been at Whithorn. So there is one locally. And we have the records of all of the bishops of Whithorn up to about the end of the 700s. And then after that point, I think the last bishop that is recorded is in the 820s. And then after that, we don't have a record of the names of the bishops of Whithorn. We know they're still there, but the records don't survive. And that's emblematic for what's going on in Galloway. The records kind of blink out. Either the records are burned or they're lost through other sort of political changes, but we're in kind of a black hole at this time in that part of the world. What we do know is that when the Hoard was buried, it was controlled by the Kingdom of Northumbria, the Anglo-Saxon kingdom. But after, in the 10th century, this becomes that kingdom known as Galloway. Galloway is actually controlled by Gaelic and Norse speakers coming over from Ireland. So they're the sort of Vikings in that area. They're the ones that are using those silver armbands. And eventually, in the century that follows, they're the ones that take over that part of the world, and then it becomes known as Galloway. So this hoard actually fits into that turning point between this area as Northumbria and this area as Galloway, that sort of Gaelic and Norse kingdom. And so what you're looking at here and what this hoard gives us a glimpse into is that turning point. So maybe this is the last hurrah of that sort of Northumbrian dynasty. This is their last big deposit, and maybe that's why they didn't come back for it. The regime has changed, and maybe these people are exiled or sort of killed off, and maybe that's why they didn't come back to it. That is a possibility. You know, and so at this point, we have to rely on archaeological finds like these to tell us what's going on. And it's very interesting that Kirkcudbright, the nearest town to where this hoard was buried, the nearest big settlement, does indeed have a Viking burial with a sword and a ring pin and beads taken to the grave. But he's buried just outside the walls of St. Cuthbert's Church. And so you can see around the year 900, things are maybe changing. Vikings are sort of settling, but they're also associating themselves with the church. So it's not a population replacement. The Norse speakers and the Gaelic speakers are taking over, but they're also integrating and they're supporting their local churches. And maybe this hoard is part of that sort of acculturation process. The mind boggles. The more that you sort of research these things, the more of these interpretations you can have. And I think that's what's so interesting about this hoard. There's still the capacity for you to use your own imagination and kind of, there's definitely a historical novel in this hoard, you know, for someone to write, you know. So there's all sorts of possibilities still left to conjure.
Thank you so much. Please everyone join me in thanking Adrian for his time today.